So today we're going to talk about this lady and the tragedy that befell her. But we're not going to get into the typical details that you see in most documentaries about the Titanic. And we're not going to delve into the Hollywood aspects of the famous film that was made and many other films that have actually been made previously as well. We're actually not going to focus on the lady on your screen now. We're going to focus on another lady, and she's a bit of an interesting character. Her name is Violet Jesop, and she's particularly interesting because not only was she a survivor of the Titanic, she also survived Titanic's sister ship's disaster. And the sister ship that I'm talking about is the Britannic. So I'm going to start getting into that as well. So I'm going to kind of preview Violet Jesop's role on the Titanic and on other ships. And I'm going to let her biographer kind of explain it. He says here that Violet Jesop was assigned to cabin service because in those days women never served in the dining saloon. Contemporary cruise ships' dining rooms also employ exclusively male waiters. Despite the recent inclusion of some female, what were her duties? She made beds, cleaned the cabin, and if there was one, its adjoining bathroom. She kept the alleyways vacuumed, swept, and dusted. She brought trays for breakfast or tea, answered summonses, ran errands, arranged flowers, turned down beds at night, put away clothing, and comforted and cosseted the seasick. He also explains what is so remarkable about Violet, even given her lowly station as a stewardess. The remarkable thing about Violet was that she never talked to a reporter, journalist, or historian before. Apparently, she had passed unnoticed when Titanic's 703 survivors sailed into the port aboard the Carpathia. The young Irish stewardess had fallen through the cracks, either evading or ignored by the army of pressmen clamoring for stories. So a little bit about her early life. Her father was William Jessop, who was an Irish immigrant to Argentina. This was a lot more common than you might think it would be. Her mother was Catherine Kelly. She apparently came to Argentina later, although it was apparent that she had met William Jessop while in Ireland and had joined him in Argentina later. So Violet relates some very fond memories of her parents and their love for each other. She says they were very much in love with one another, in love with life and ready for all adventures. When I arrived one stormy Saturday soon after they moved into their new home, they were extremely proud and content with life. As to her early childhood, she says, life was much simpler then. A man was taken at his worth all the time. Our neighbors had all come from different walks in life. Many were British, of good social standing in their own country, who had left home because of sun lapse. They had come to Argentina to start afresh. Quite a few had warm hospitality shown to all friends, irrespective of their worldly means. So Violet also indicated that this carefree life terminated when my father, not having the means for a full flock of sheep, without which very little headway could be made, accepted a post with the Port Authority in Bahia Blanca. For the first time I went to live in a real house made of bricks with wood floors in place of mud. So that move eventually led to her father going to work for the railroad. And at this point in her life, she relates a very tragic story of her younger brother dying of scarlet fever, which profoundly changed her mother. And she indicated that she no longer sang at her work and would sit with a faraway look in her eyes, reciting her rosary. So after a time, Violet developed a lung ailment, tuberculosis. This was the first of many health issues that Violet would have in her upbringing. Also during this time, more tragedy struck as her father passed away in Argentina. And due to very little opportunity for the new fatherless family, which now had 6 children total, they moved to England. So Violet said, "With a heavy heart, I bid goodbye to my beloved mountains, those glorious Andes. I was leaving for a new country whose people, by Argentine standards, seemed cold to me, for a new life where nothing would ever be the same again, and where I felt sure I would often need the reassuring pressure of a hand now forever stilled. One glorious autumn day in April, a day so brilliantly blue of sky with tiny white clouds that it gave me an ache to look at it, saw us packed into the train for Buenos Aires. That train journey seemed never ending. To Mother, it must have appeared like a lifetime." So this was a very sad time for the family, as the mother at this time in England was unemployed, and for a time some of the kids had to go live in an orphanage. Her mother did finally secure a job. So the job was with Royal Mail as a stewardess on a ship, and a little bit of explanation is sort of in order. So at that particular time, many ships were owned by Royal Mail, and those ships could be used for carrying cargo. They could be used for carrying passengers and mail all at the same time. So you would hear about certain ships being an RMS ship, such as the Titanic. That RMS stands for Royal Mail Service. So even though the Titanic was carrying passengers across the transatlantic, it also was carrying mail as well. So that's just an interesting side note there. So she was working for Royal Mail as a stewardess on a ship. Occasionally, when her ship would port home, she would visit the children. Violet's life in particular at this time was sometimes spent in hospitals due to bouts of lung hemorrhaging and gallstones. When her mother was at sea, teenage Violet was responsible for her younger sister Eileen, and they lived in one bedroom at a boarding house. Violet was also in school at a Catholic convent. Violet received word that her mother was in poor health and had to leave her post on the ship, and since the family had no income, Violet decided to apply for a job at sea and to give up her studies. About her prospects, Violet says, "In those days there were comparatively few posts at sea for women, therefore the ones who did choose that life were treated with deference and a consideration that is unknown today." Regarding her interview, Violet indicated, "The meeting seemed to go well from the start until he remarked that he had misgivings. He enumerated his objections. I was far too young. They generally took officers' widows, and then again I was too attractive." These outspoken criticisms, even from a charming and obviously sedate elderly man, embarrassed me. In the year 1908, one's good looks were not openly commented on. But in spite of all that, she was accepted and determined to, as she said, make my attractiveness as inconspicuous as possible. She referred to the clothing that she was getting ready to go work in as a man-frightening wardrobe that would satisfy a paternally inclined shipping company. She described the dress she wore as an awful gray dress, and she said the dress reminded her of that of a female prisoner. Her first post was as a stewardess on a Royal Mail steamer called the Orinoco, and I've put a picture up of that. The ship sailed to the Caribbean. She described her quarters on the Orinoco as a short bunk in a tiny cabin above the ship's propellers, where she felt every vibration. She relates of happier times at port, mentioning going on shore on a rare free day in Jamaica. Violet spent time away from the ship with a man named Ned who had expressed interest in her romantically. In an unfortunate encounter that they had with a crocodile, they were very lucky to escape. She describes her interactions with American men who she received marriage proposals from, even though they had only known her a couple of days. She also describes interactions with Americans. So about Americans, she says, intermixed with Americans' subtle ingenuity and good nature is a streak of selfishness. They want the best that life has to offer, and they get it in their stride, leaving one panting and exhausted in the process. In later years and on larger ships, how often I've trudged on aching feet and nerve-racked, back up and down stairs, to and fro, sweltering in unbelievable heat, to satisfy the gastronomic exactitude of some noted woman. The daily papers may have classified her as an angel of benevolence, but she never hesitated to demand of me what she wanted, no matter how her request upset my daily routine, and in spite of the fact that she liked me, openly declaring to all and sundry that she simply adored me. So also she describes uncomfortable situation with ship employees on the Orinoco that would be considered most certainly sexual harassment, even one situation that was borderline attempted rape. Even the ship's captain was very lecherous, and I'm going to read to you something here that gives you a little more specifics on that. And she says, the effrontery of them, the captain, the purser, many others who had positions to maintain, groveling and sniveling like dogs, yet they would be my judges, should I or the likes of me make one false step on board. In their power lay our very existence. I was revolted. I needed someone to talk to, yet there was nobody I could open my heart to who would understand, for I felt that sea life was not the setting for a normal woman, however it might afford her a living. Repression was forced, and freedom of speech, idealism, or attempts at outside interests were put down. Later, the captain of the Orinoco had her fired, presumably for rebuffing his advances, but he accused her of flirting with his officers. She applied for other ship lines after that, but was rejected, with the exception of the White Star Line, which sailed the North Atlantic. And this was a post aboard the Majestic. She was not looking forward to working for them, as she had heard their reputation for having long hours and arduous work, but she described the clientele of White Star, mostly American, as friendly, understanding, and appreciative. But she actually thrived during her time on the Majestic, promoting up from second-class service to first-class service. Eventually, she got selected to serve aboard the Olympic, and I'm flashing up a little film of that particular ship. At its time, the Olympic was regarded as the largest and finest ship to fly the British flag. Violet was very thrilled with this opportunity, as stewards aboard this ship were better treated. She spent a year aboard this ship. Violet describes her time aboard it as gone before I was aware it was over, for they were preparing to move her to another ship, and this is the build up to why this video exists, as she was assigned to the Titanic. As the Titanic readied for its first and only voyage, Violet details some of the passengers, including one cantankerous old lady. In the distance, I could see old Miss Townsend arrived. She had been blacklisted by other famous shipping lines because of her utterly reasonable behavior and her demoralizing effect on other passengers. She began by demanding mirrors everywhere and that the furniture in her luxurious stateroom should be changed at once. Probably her happiest moments were spent watching the agonized struggles of a couple of perspiring stewards tackling the job, their red faces, however, not all due to their exertions on her behalf. Violet describes the scene as Titanic began to leave port. She says, gently, Titanic disengaged herself from the side of the dock, and we were off on a soft April day, slipping gracefully away, full of high hope, over the din of send-off, goodbyes, fluttering flags, and handkerchiefs. We were proudly escorted by the tugs, tooting their farewells and Godspeed, while from the dock the sounds grew fainter. Few members of the staff had time or opportunity to witness a departure. I had often wished to see the ship I sailed on from some other vantage point at sea, to know just how she moved on her way. I'd like to have been a watcher instead of a worker, and on that sailing day my desire was very strong. But however beautiful I pictured our new ship, I realized only too well it would have to be a wish only for a long time. She also describes her interactions with Jock Hume, the famous violin player who met an untimely end but was very brave and continued playing as the ship went down. It was all so happy and peaceful, if the sun did fail to shine so brightly on the fourth day out, and if a little cold nip crept into the air as evening set in, it only served to emphasize the warmth and luxuriousness within. On that Sunday evening, the music was at its gayest, led by young Jock, the first violin. When I ran into him during the interval, he laughingly called out to me in his rich Scotch accent that he was about to give them a real tune, a Scotch tune, to finish up with. Always so eager and full of life was Jock. So Violet describes how it all started. She indicated a loud crashing sound, which I will not imitate, as we are trying to do ASMR here. But then I'm going to explain the rest of what she heard. Then a low, rending, crunching, ripping sound as Titanic shivered a trifle, and the sound of her engines gently ceased. Dead silence for a minute, then doors opened and voices could be heard in gentle inquiry. Quietly, restrained voices past our door answered just as quietly. I lay still. Not even to myself would I express what was in my mind. I must not show at that moment the ever-present fear that I had so far successfully kept locked in my heart. Only once in an unguarded moment during a raging storm had that fear betrayed me, causing my pride pain from the jests and jeers of others afterwards. Suddenly there was movement. Men were returning to duty they had but recently left. I realized that I too must hasten on duty, for I had quite a number of women in my section. Good old faithful Stanley, one of my bedroom stewards, came knocking at the door, his face whiter than usual, as he remarked casually, "I'm calling all our people, sister." He always addressed me as sister when we were alone. "Anything you'd like for me to do on my way? You know the ship is sinking." Sinking? The word repeated itself without fully entering my understanding as I finished putting on my uniform and quickly followed Stanley to our section. Sinking? Of course Titanic couldn't be sinking. What nonsense. She's so perfect, she's so new, yet she was so still, so inanimate, not a sound after that awful grinding crash. She that had so short a time ago had become so vital was the embodiment of immobility. Violet relates also how she saw Captain Smith and Bruce Ismay, who was the managing director of the line, chatting quietly. They smiled at her, and she waved back. Later, she explained nobody was taking the seriousness of anything. She spotted the violin player, Jacques Hume, who said, "Just gonna give them a tune to cheer things up a bit." She spotted one young woman arguing with an officer to get in a lifeboat. The girl refused to go without her father. The officer said he must wait till all the decks are cleared of women and children. She said overall, though, there wasn't a huge panic. Nobody was anxious to move. Titanic seemed so steady. To justify their reluctance, some pointed to a light on the horizon. Another ship's lights. People are reassured, content to bide their time. Violet mentioned how one boat was being lowered with very few people in it. As some realized this was happening, a crowd lurched forward to jump on the boat. This time the boat was too full, but reality set in when she saw the white distress rockets shoot up. Violet said a few women began weeping when they realized they had to be separated from their husbands. She saw one man hurl himself from the side of the ship into a descending boat. Then Violet saw something that really disturbed her. I turned to say something. Looking along the length of the ship, I noticed the forward part of her was lower now, much lower. For a fraction of a second, my heart stood still, as is often the case when faith, hitherto unshaken faith, gets its first setback. Violet indicates she could hear the sound of Jock Hume playing Nearer My God to Thee. As Violet was being lowered into the lifeboat, she heard a voice say, "Look after this, will you?" And she was given someone's forgotten baby in her arms. Surely it's all a dream, I thought as I looked up the side of the ship, beautifully illuminated, each deck alive with lights. The dynamos were on the top deck. I tried to make myself believe it could not be true, all this. I even noticed a few people leaning over the rail, watching it in an unconcerned manner because they too were pretending to themselves that this was all a dream. A tiny breeze, the first we had felt on this calm night, blew an icy blast across my face. It felt like a knife in its penetrating coldness. I sat paralyzed with cold and misery as I watched Titanic give a lurch forward. One of the huge funnels toppled off like a cardboard model, falling into the sea with a fearful roar. A few cries came to us across the water, then silence, as the ship seemed to right herself like a hurt animal with a broken back. She settled for a few minutes, but one more deck of lighted ports disappeared. Then she went down by the head with a thundering roar of underwater explosions. Our proud, our ship, our beautiful Titanic, gone to her doom. The fact that there were not enough lifeboats was confusing to Violet, as she was aware that in Southampton there were always inspections to assure the bare minimum of safety. She was not aware of the business decision the Titanic owner made to avoid cluttering the deck as to not obscure the view of first-class passengers. Once more the ship was seen as unsinkable, of course. Violet relates the hours they were waiting in the lifeboat of being a time where they were too cold to move. But then finally, Violet relates they did have one glimmer of hope. Then suddenly a flicker of hope revived. Somebody woke from their lethargic state and pointed a trembling figure at a dark speck on the horizon. A ship, not going away from us this time, but getting closer and more distinct every minute. Sudden joy seems at times almost as disastrous to the human makeup as sudden fear. Many among those poor weeping frozen people, murmuring prayers in a soft monotone, nearly died with emotion when they sighted the ship. They must have been thinking more of their dear ones than of themselves, hoping in their bewildered hearts that there might be a chance yet that those missing loved ones could have been picked up by the approaching vessel. All the women in our boat had been immigrants who had left their menfolk on board. The ship that they had seen was the Carpathia. As they made it to the deck, they were given blankets and brandy. As Violet stood there clutching the baby in her arms, a woman came up and grabbed the baby and ran away with it. Violet wondered why, whoever the mother was, why she would not express gratitude for the baby's life being saved. Violet heard on the Carpathia about how one of the officers that survived had gone down with the ship, and by some miracle, an explosion blew the officer out of the wreck, and he managed to get on a lifeboat. This was Second Officer Herbert Lightroller, one of the heroes of the ships. He had saved many lives that day. Violet mentioned that they had to sleep on the deck of the Carpathia as it headed for New York, but she said they slept on benches, looked at the stars, and were thankful. Later, Violet explained how she was profoundly changed by her experience. I wanted the quietness of happy contentment, not the hectic turmoil of riches which sapped simplicity and spontaneous kindness out of people. I wanted desperately to shut out the encroachment of sea life on my inner self, to retain something I feared I was losing when a kind action is performed for the love of pleasing and not for gain. I had gained one thing. I had learned to look very deeply into people and to value them for what I found. Famous names and possessions no longer moved me. I was more confident when confronted by some powerful women whose cold eyes, as I served her breakfast, might have shattered me. But each day it was more difficult to be my simple self, to ignore the pettiness, artificiality, and frothy gaiety that encompassed a stewardess's life on board ship. After being on other ships post-Titanic, World War I broke out. Jessop's biographer, John Maxtone Graham, explains her time in the war effort as a nurse. Violet Jesop decided to join the war effort as a junior nurse, enlisting in a nursing organization set up in 1908 by the British Red Cross Society at the invitation of the War Office. It would form a hospital arm for the newly established Territorial Army. Nursing was a profession in which she was extremely well suited, as though the long hospital stays of her childhood has somehow heightened her sensitivity to suffering. And in 1916, as fate would have it, Violet would be transferred to the sister ship of Titanic, the Britannic, which was being used as a hospital ship. Like the Titanic, the Britannic met an unfortunate disaster. In this case, a German mine that was apparently planted by a U-boat blew up the ship. Violet described it like this. Suddenly there was a dull, deafening roar. Britannic gave a shiver, a long drawn-out shudder from stem to stern, shaking the crockery on the tables, breaking things till it subsided as she slowly continued on her way. We all knew she had been struck. As one man, the whole saloon rose from their seats. Doctors, nurses vanished to their post in a trice. The pantry where I stood, holding a teapot in one hand and a pat of butter in the other, was cleared too as men dropped what they were doing and jumped over presses with the agility of deer. In seconds, not a soul was to be seen and not a sound had been uttered. This contrasted so forcibly with my recollections, not so far distant, of Titanic's night of doom. The hurried calmness with which we then confronted the unexpected left an impression that has remained with me vividly ever since. But this was different. War, with all its anticipated horrors and ghastly possibilities, filled the imaginations of those who feared and yet had not foreseen danger. The lifeboats, while aplenty on this voyage, were not without their problems. Violet's lifeboat, upon hitting the water, made a terrible impact and then had trouble getting away from the side of the ship. The Britannic's propellers were churning, essentially chewing up lifeboats and people. 28 people died overall. Violet describes her experience like this. Britannic was still proceeding under her own steam. A few minutes after the lifeboat first touched the water, every man jack in the group of surrounding boats took a flying leap into the sea. They came thudding from behind and all around me, taking to the water like a vast army of rats. Not a word, not a shout was heard, just hundreds of men fleeing into the sea, as if from an enemy in pursuit. It was extraordinary to find myself in the space of a few minutes, almost the only occupant of the boat. I say almost, for one man, a doctor, was still standing in silence beside me. I turned around to see the reason for this exodus, and to my horror, I saw Britannic's huge propellers churning and mincing up everything near them. Men, boats, and everything were just one ghastly whirl. I turned in consternation to the man beside me to find that he too had slipped silently away. In another moment I would be under those glittering, relentless blades, unless I looked at the equally exultable sea, and for a fraction of a second I hesitated, for I have always been afraid of water. Drowning was my one irrational fear all my life. I had not been able to learn to swim because of the loss of part of one lung in those far-off Argentine days. Then suddenly I was no longer unconscious of fear. I knew I must go into the sea, and I had to make the decision alone. I just jumped overboard, leaving everything that was solid, not even wondering why I did so, going down and down into what seemed to be bottomless depths, clutching desperately at my life belt, which was somewhat tangible, though it had become loose and was bothering my chin. Suddenly, joy of joys, I touched something, an arm that moved as mine moved. My fingers gripped it like a vice, but only for a second, until all my senseless head remembered what is said of the people drowning, that they retain their hold after death, bringing death to another. With that cheering thought, I let go. I heard a voice quite near me hail the boat and cry, "There's a woman in the water here." As I turned my head in surprise and gratitude for such an act of generosity, I saw the owner of the voice give a fearful gasp and disappear from view. I felt that at least I could do was to keep calm as possible. Found myself able to smile when it was my turn to be hauled in. This seemed to occasion surprise, though I cannot imagine why I shouldn't smile after such an escape. Violet had several injuries and would eventually recover. She would eventually go back to being aboard the Olympic and would go other places as well. She would be back to her stewardess role once again, but during that period of her life, she would marry a fellow steward. The marriage would only last a year. Later in the 1950s, Violet would retire from the cruise industry after spending many years there, including some where she was circumnavigating cruises around the world. She died in 1971 of congestive heart failure. I appreciate your attention as we have gone through this amazing story of this amazing person and the amazing life she led, surviving two major disasters. Thank you for joining me. See you next time. Good night.